great pleasure to be here on this special night, and our thanks to President Clinton for those remarks. I have heard him say that Yitzhak Rabin was one of the leaders that he most admired. I know Martin Indyk can talk more about that as well. But this is a very, very special night, and I'm honored once again for my sixth time to be here to not only honor him, but honor the good work that the Rabin Medical Center is doing. And we celebrate tonight the 20th anniversary of American Friends of the Rabin Medical Center. This year also, as you know, marks a very tragic and a very important anniversary for Israel, for the United States, and for the whole world, all who lost. It was 20 years ago on November 4th at 8:30 p.m. that Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated. He was a man that I knew personally and would love to share with you just a few memories of the man for whom this organization was named Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. I have said before at this event, and you've all heard, so I won't repeat the story, but we did a number of interviews of which you'll see a little excerpt from one of them, and you'll see him, and you can almost hear him and feel his presence as someone who came back to the prime ministership and really, as Henry Kissinger has said, was a great man when he came to the prime ministership at that time. And we are continuing, as we look at conflict in the Middle East, to be reminded of what we lost and what a great man he was. I will never forget going to his apartment to have dinner, and there he was, and Leo came to the door, and you don't see security. I mean, you know they're all there, but you never see them. And you go to the door, and I knocked on the door, and Leo came in, and she said, "Come on in, he's watching a soccer match." And so I went in and sat down, and he was smoking a cigarette, and he was watching the soccer match and clearly enjoying it. And then the phone would ring, and he would just pick it up and say, "Hello." Since I don't speak Yiddish or Hebrew or any other language of the Middle East, I didn't know what he was saying. But clearly, there was this kind of simplicity of command that he had that made him a great leader and gave him the authority that he had. And we can never remember the need that we have for people who exert that kind of leadership in the world. Someone else who knew Yitzhak Rabin very well and was there at the final moments. His name is Ambassador Martin Indyk. He is currently the Executive Vice President at the Brookings Institution. He is, as many of you know, an expert on the Middle East, as well as its politics and its history. He was a U.S. ambassador to Israel, and he knew and worked with Yitzhak Rabin. Ambassador Indyk was twice appointed to serve as the ambassador to Israel, which included the very time of Rabin's assassination, November 4th, 1995. He most recently served as U.S. Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations during the 2013 and 2014. And before that, as Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs during the Clinton administration. He also served as the Funding Executive Director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm pleased to have him join me for a conversation about Yitzhak Rabin. Welcome.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. It's an amazing turnout for a great organization. I'm really very pleased to be here. I can't do the gravel voice of Henry Kissinger or Yitzhak Rabin, but I will certainly do my best to remember this great man.
Seeing him on screen again, tell me what you felt.
You know, he was a very shy man, taciturn, man of few words, but great conviction. And at the time that I had the honor to work with him, with President Clinton, first when I was in the White House, and he had just been re-elected as Prime Minister, he came there in what I considered to be his heroic phase. He was a man who had been a warrior, Israel's greatest general to that point, the chief of staff of the Israeli army during the Six-Day War. Before that, he had liberated Jerusalem back in the War of Independence in 1947. And now he came to the White House to tell President Clinton that he was going to be a warrior in the cause of peace. And that's what struck me about that. You saw Rabin in his heroic phase when he had the strongest conviction that he was going to lead his country to peace.
He felt like you could take a risk for peace, and no one was more committed to Israel's national security, as every prime minister swears himself to be, and herself. And yet he believed that it was necessary for him to do things he might not have otherwise wanted to do. Come to the White House and shake hands with Yitzhak Rabin.
With Yasser Arafat.
Yasser Arafat.
Yeah. You know, people say that he was reluctant to shake his hand, and that is true. But he wasn't reluctant at all to make peace with the PLO. As shocking as that was to so many, particularly in the American Jewish community at the time, because Arafat was a terrorist. But Yitzhak Rabin had this basic principle that you make peace with your enemies, not with your friends. And he understood that there had to be a way to ensure Israel's future, a secure future. There had to be a way to reconcile with the Palestinians. And he tested the proposition of trying to work with other Palestinians and came to the conclusion, and this was typical of Yitzhak, that he read the map. He was a total realist in that regard. So he looked at the situation, he said, there's only one guy on the Palestinian side that can make the decision, and that's Yasser Arafat. So I'm going to deal with Yasser Arafat. And that's what that handshake was about. It was about reconciliation between Israelis and Palestinians. But his principle was that the way to secure Israel was to separate from the Palestinians. And there was a moment there that few people will remember. I don't know whether you were there at the time. It was the second time Rabin and Arafat came to Washington to sign another agreement, the Oslo II agreement, in 1995, about 6 months before his assassination. And there, after the signing ceremony, there was a reception for members of the American Jewish community and the Arab American community. Maybe some of you were there for that. And they gave impromptu speeches. And Arafat gave quite a good speech, freed of his ideological speechwriters, about the need for peace and the recognition of the Jewish state. And Yitzhak Rabin, for the first time, talked about a Palestinian state. People forget that in the Oslo Agreement, there was nothing about a Palestinian state. All it was a process that would lead to a final status negotiation. But it didn't have a Palestinian state in it. For the first time, Rabin talked about Palestinian statehood then. And he said, what we need, Mr. Chairman, is separation, not out of hatred, but out of respect. That was his vision of two states living side by side with respect for each other.
He talked to me once about being able to escape the fear, that terrorism brought. He said the Israeli Defense Force is too strong for us to live in fear. We have to move beyond the terrible tragedy that terrorism brings, as he defined it, and be strong and confident in our own vision of the future.
He said it in that interview with you. You have such an incredible talent at bringing these things out. And he said it to you about in two ways. We have to take calculated risks for peace. We are masters of our own fate. That is a very Mapai Labour Party kind of approach that starts with Ben Gurion. We take our fate into our own hands. It's that kind of Zionism. We are not victims. We're not, we don't have to play the victim anymore. We're strong. We have a strong army, a strong economy, the backing of the United States. We can do this if it's calculated risks. And he said to you, we have to pursue peace as if there were no terror and fight terror as if there was no peace process. That was his fundamental principle. and because he understood that the enemies of peace would try to destroy it through violence and terror. And you couldn't let them do that. You had to proceed as if they were not going to stop you and fight them with all your might at the same time.
I remember that conversation because it took place after he was very tired. You know, he'd been in Washington and was long and tired. We went back out to the public television studio out in Arlington, Virginia, you know, and he came, and I think he was so tired that he just felt like he had to speak from the heart. And it's been in my mind since all this last 20 years it has. Where were you 20 years ago in November?
My son Jake, who's in the audience, and I had just done a 10K run, and I was in the bath because my muscles were killing me. Yitzhak had asked me not to come to the peace rally. He didn't want to politicize the US ambassador. And so I was at home. I got a phone call from Eitan Harber, who was his chief of staff. And he simply said, Yitzhak's been shot, meet me at Ichilov. Ichilov was the hospital in the heart of Tel Aviv where he was taken. And so I raced down there, and while I was in the car, they were already announcing on the news that the American ambassador was at the hospital, which was kind of interesting because at that moment of such trauma for the nation, the idea that the symbol of the United States was going to be there with them was critically important to and that's the role that the United States plays so critically in Israel's ability to deal with these situations, that we would be there with them. And so I raced to the hospital. When I got there, I went down to the basement where he was supposed to be, and there was Eitan Harber, who had called me, and he was writing. He wouldn't look up. He was just writing something. And Rabin's director general came out and told me Yitzhak is dead. What Eitan was writing was the announcement that he then went out and made to the world that their leader had been assassinated. And I was then led in to see Leah and the family, who were in a room on their own. Everybody else was kind of waiting outside. And of course, she was inconsolable. Then suddenly they got up and took her to see Yitzhak, to see the body. And I tried to find a phone to call the White House. And none of the cell phones worked down there, so I found a landline, and I picked it up as I was trying to get an outside line, and by some strange coincidence, it was the White House Situation Room on the line. And I said, well, this is the ambassador, and they put the president through. And I said, Mr. President, it's terrible, and he sounded terrible. And I said to him, you know, in Jewish tradition, they bury their dead very quickly, within 24 hours if they can. So the funeral is going to be 24 to 48 hours from now. He said, I'll be there. So I said, wow, that's really important. Can you wait on the line while I try to find Leah? And I went in, and she was just being brought out. She was inconsolable, but I asked her whether she wanted to speak to the president. She said yes, and she came to the phone. She picked it up and she said, the idiot, the idiot, the idiot, the idiot killed my Yitzhak. So that was it.
So recently you've been engaged with John Kerry in trying to bring some peace settlement between Israel and the Palestinians. It was not successful. What's the problem?
You know, the biggest problem, and there are many, but the biggest problem is a lack of trust. A lack of trust between the people on both sides who do not believe that the other side wants peace. and a lack of trust between the two leaders. And if you had trust between the leaders, you could overcome the lack of trust between the people. But without that, it's impossible to change the minds of the people. And the lack of trust in the minds of the people meant that they did not press their leaders to make peace. On the contrary, they pressed them not to because they didn't trust in it. Yitzhak and Yasser Arafat had a relationship of trust. As strange as that may sound, because Arafat is so reviled, but Yitzhak understood, and with his partner Shimon Peres, that Yasser Arafat had the legitimacy amongst his people to make the compromises necessary to reach a deal. And they essentially put their arms around him. It was like dancing with a bear. But they put their arms around him and they moved him forward. And they had a way of understanding that there were certain things that he needed, and they found ways to help him. And Arafat responded, reciprocated, by trying to find ways to help Rabin with his political problems. And out of that, they built a relationship of trust, which is why when people ask, would it have been different? I say, yes, it would have been different, because the leaders, at least, had a relationship of trust.
If Rabin had survived and been able to continue to lead the country.
Exactly.
How do you build that trust again? I mean, is it a question of great leaders? If that's what you have to have, people who are willing to.
I think that without leaders like Yitzhak Rabin and Anwar Sadat and King Hussein of Jordan and Menachem Begin, it's impossible to do it. And it's exactly what Yitzhak said. It's, to take calculated risks for peace. But that means taking risks. That's what he said to President Clinton on his first visit. And what Clinton responded to him was, if you're going to do that, I'm going to underwrite those risks. I'm going to provide you with a safety net. And that partnership which was forged between Clinton and Rabin was critical to the ability of Rabin to take those risks on behalf of Israel, because he knew that Clinton was behind him, had his back. And that's part of the problem now, is that the relationship between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu has become so toxic, so distrustful, that they don't have that relationship of trust either, so it becomes much more difficult to move forward. But yes, it takes great leaders, and without that, it's impossible to expect that the people will simply rise up and demand.
If you were writing the first line of his obituary, Yitzhak Rabin, what would you say?
That he was a warrior in the cause of peace, who gave his life for a vision of a secure Israel living at peace with its neighbors.
This is an important night. Our thanks to Martin Indyk. Thank you.
Thank you.